All right, so next thing we're going to look at is position. So hopefully we'll look at position and float today. So we've looked at display. And just a little bit of a reminder, we had our outline stuff where we're like, just use H1 through H6. And here's this other stuff about the document outline algorithm, which nobody uses, but you know about so that you won't get confused. You understand it when you see it in the documentation. All right, and then we said, hey, box model. Remember the box model, content, padding, border, margin. Got it. And then box sizing, border box. Okay, I could change my padding, and I could change my border, and it doesn't screw up my layout. And then margin zero auto, I center stuff on the page. And then we did display, and we have inline, inline block. We have block, inline, inline block, and none. Those are the main ones. And then we did a menu with that, right? Where we did list style. What is it?
List style type none.
List style type none. Get rid of the bullets, and we did display inline block, I think, to get the menu working. Did we do inline block? Was that the one we just did, or was it inline? Inline block, inline block. That was pretty cool. So we just did all that stuff, and now we're going to look at position. So position's a new property. Now remember with CSS, we have a rule set. CSS, we have a rule set. Here's a rule set. It's made up of selector, selectors, and then a declaration block. Declaration block has declarations. Declarations are made up of properties and values. We're learning about a new property. The new property we are learning about is position. We will be able to set some of the values like fixed, relative, absolute. So let's take a look at fixed. Position fixed. And here's the CSS. So we can see position fixed. That's cool. Let's see what it looks like. So as I scroll everything else on the page, that thing's just fixed. So aptly named. And if we look at the code here, body, we have div ID static, div ID fixed. And our div, border radius 5 pixels, and border 2 pix solid black. 2 pix solid black. So that's that one for the div. Got applied to both. But then static, 4 pix dash red on static, and okay, that makes sense. I kind of like having the border on, not on both like that. That's a little confusing. Put that down here. So height 1500, width 150, background color, margin left, and border 4 pix dash red. So that's the static one, this big green thing. And then the fixed ones, height, width 75 pixels. Background color, position fixed, top left 20 and 10, and then border right there. I'll put this up here. Because position, top, and left all go together. And if we go and we look at MDN position, we could see some of the things over here. So this applies to all elements. Just looking at some of those different ones, different choices. Applies to inherited media computable. Position property chooses alternative rules for positioning elements designed to be useful for scripted animation effects. That's kind of interesting. It's designed for scripted animation effects. And then co-opted for other uses. So then we have the syntax, we have the values and the formal syntax and examples. We can look at the values. So here properties are set to values. So this is looking at the position property, and here are the values. Static, relative, absolute, fixed. Sticky is still experimental. because it's got a little bit of a scientist's flask right there. Scientists like to have their flasks full of whiskey when they're working. Makes them more productive. And then they have some examples if you want to look at the examples. So this type of positioning is fairly rare, but it certainly has uses. This is from MDN. No, it's not. It's from CSS Tricks. This type of positioning is rare, but certainly has its uses. A fixed position element is positioned relative to the viewport or the browser window itself. The viewport doesn't change when the window is scrolled, so a fixed position element will stay right where it is when the page is scrolled. That's cool. You guys have seen examples of that, I'm sure, on different websites, right? Do you guys still go to websites? I feel like I'm teaching, like, I don't know, what's a religion that's died? Now I can't say any religion because I'll offend somebody. Druidism. Druids. The Druid religion. Huh? You're offended? There's this funny story about, I heard a teacher tell one time, is about this guy who was like, in the military and wanted a weekend pass, but they all got canceled. And he said, he still needed the weekend, needed to go because it was part of his religious background. They had a annual ceremony they do every year. And he was like, what's your religious background? He said, I'm a Druid. And the guy was a Druid. Let me see your dog tags. Sure enough, on his dog tags it said Druid. And so the sergeant gave him the weekend off. And he's like, Druids, aren't you the guys that kill goats? And then the guy said, no, those are the Orthodox. We're the Reformed. Reformed Druids. We don't kill goats. I thought it was funny. So here's another example of fixed.
Are you saying that because you think most of them are mobile, that they don't go to full websites on desktop anymore?
Just because, the web used to be like, wow, and websites amazing. And I still think creating websites is the best out of, Android, iOS, web. But Android, iOS have fragmented that. And then there's also been massive market consolidation. And so that zeitgeist of people discovering and new things being discovered has really sort of been consolidated into Walmart, Costco, as opposed to every farmer and blacksmith and shop, and what do you find in new towns? And here's somebody who makes, this unique craft item. Now it's just all mass produced and from 5 big manufacturers. That's a little bit of it. That said, I think there is still lots of stuff being discovered, and I think it's tremendous opportunity. You could just get in there and start carving out a niche. And those success stories on Code Academy are a good place to look. And we saw this at the beginning, but stories right here about people who've learned to code and then actually went out and built stuff and hey, look what I'm doing. I'm selling my T-shirts or whatever. So I think it's pretty cool, especially if you enjoy the craft. So that's the next example right here. And so this is just 2 divs, and number 1 and number 2. And 1 is the one with info. And so this is 100 by 100 and a color and a position fixed. And then just font stuff. Color for the font weight, and text align center. Is that offset from the page at all? There's a little bit there. And that's because both divs have a border radius. Border radius, that's rounding it. But number 2, border. I don't have a border on this one. This one's got a 5-pix dash red. 5-pix dash red. I'm looking for margin 0 auto. That's centered that one over to the right. And I made the width just a certain width. So kind of funky. That's position fixed. You guys want to try position fixed? Just to mix it up, code a little. Looks like we might just begin through position today. Or you want me to roll on? How many people want to try coding a position fix? Code it up. So you might try, a percentage layout, an inline block. So hey, this one's 10%, this one's 90% inline block. And I'll come over and give you a hand. And I'll give you some homework so you can do some of the stuff at home. So we just saw position fixed. Let me show you position relative. So here's position relative. So position relative is relative to itself. We got 3 divs there, 1, 2, and whatever the other one is, 1 again. Okay, and then we have relative 1 and relative 2 in our CSS. And if we look at those, we have relative 2 is set position relative, top and left, 20/20. So relative to where it would have normally been, just move it that way. And it just kind of does it on top of everything else, right? So you can see it kind of overwrote this stuff down below. It's just like, I'm moving. And it just moves it relative to where it would have normally been. So that's what relative is. It's relative to itself. And there's a couple of descriptions in there that say that. Relative positioning tells the element to move relative to where it would have landed if it just the default static positioning. If you give an element relative positioning and tell it to have a margin top of 10, it doesn't move down 10 pixels from any particular thing. It moves down 10 pixels from where it would have otherwise been. So relative to itself again. Relative behaves the same as static unless you add some extra properties. So the extra properties are like top. Setting top, right, bottom, and left properties of relatively positioned element will cause it to be adjusted away from its normal position. Other content will not be adjusted to fit into any gap left by the element. With relatively positioned elements, it's important to know that the box offset properties identify where an element will be moved from given its original position. And then finally, CSS Trick says, what it really means is relative to itself. If you set position relative on an element but no other positioning attributes, it will have no effect on its positioning at all. It will be exactly as it would have been if you left it position static. But if you do give it some positioning elements, say top 10 pixels, it will shift its position 10 pixels down from where it would have normally be. I'm sure you can imagine the ability to shift an element around based on its regular position is pretty useful. I find myself using this to line up form elements many times that have tendency to not want to line up how I want them to. So I just think those are kind of nice to read, different people's perspectives on these things. Here's one more example of relative. Just moving it in a slightly different way. And so that's what this CSS looks like. Top 0, it's not going anywhere. And I could clean that up, right? Or I could just take it out. And I'm just moving it to the right 10 pixels. And that's not going to change anything. By the way, when you give something a 0, you don't give it any type of a measure. So we've had position fixed, we've had position relative, we have position absolute. Let's take a look at absolute. So absolute is going to apply to the next thing up, which has some sort of positioning, or the whole page, right? So the CSS on this. Looks like, let's see what the page looks like first. Cool, so there's a relative box and an absolute box, right? And the one we're looking at right now is absolute. And so we have the class absolute has position absolute. And this one right above just has position relative. So relative is containing absolute. Absolute looks up the DOM. The DOM is the document object model. The document object model is all of the HTML. Basically, it's a model of the objects on your document. Here's my document. You guys know the document object model? How many people don't know the DOM? Okay, so here's the DOM. Let me show you an image. That's not it. That's not it. This is it. We didn't see this in class? Okay, so the document object model is a model of all the objects on the document. Things in programming are often called objects in many different programming arenas. And so here's, the document has the root element HTML. HTML has the head and the body. elements. The body element in this example has anchor tag with the href attribute, and it has an h1 tag element, and then there's text. So those are all. This is a model of all the different objects on this document. So when we talk about the DOM, that's what we're talking about. And when we look at performance and how browsers render pages, we'll learn about walking the DOM and building the DOM and how that takes time. And so here, we have. I start talking about DOM because, as looks up the DOM, right, and it just finds the next element, which has some sort of positioning. So so the next element with positioning is relative. This one here. And so absolute will position itself to the next thing which has positioning. And so to the next thing that has positioning, come down 120, come off the right 120, and give it a width and a height. Let me just move those two up so that we have these all grouped. Position, top, right, all kind of go together. So what would happen if I said, hey, this is I'm going to take this out? Right? So no class relative here. That's funny. But it just walked up the DOM and said, all right, I'll position myself down 120 and 20 off of the whole document. Put that back in. Positions itself there. We could also take this out here. Just take out relative. It's another way to see the exact same thing, right? Everybody understand why it did that? Because it looks, position absolute looks up. What's the next thing that has positioning? Doesn't find anything. So now it's coming down 120 from the top and 20 from the right. 120 from the top, 20 from the right. But when I have this here, oh, the next thing that has positioning is this. So I'll come down 120 from that and 20 from its right. So it's absolute. It's kind of the, absolute relative to the next thing up the DOM. I think this would actually be better for, I think this would be better, this would be better relative because it's relative to the next thing up the DOM. And the one that's relative, where it's relative to itself, should just be absolute. From where I'm at, go this distance. I think they got the words wrong, but I'm sure they had many conversations about it. So it's kind of counterintuitive to me. I didn't include any notes about absolute. That's absolute. So here's the taco truck example for doing it with position. Same deal. Taco truck, but instead of doing inline block like we did here, we have done this, where we have div class container, kind of surrounds everything, and then we have a nav and a main, and the nav is absolute, so it's going to walk up the DOM and look for the next thing with position. There it is. Right? But there's no top or right or left or anything, so those are all just zeros. So it's just saying, all right, I'm going to position myself in the top left corner of this one. And then main is margin 0, 0. This is a good example of code that needs to be cleaned up. So I'm going to clean this up. Let's clean it up together. Over my CSS, what's one of the first things I could do to clean up my code? I've got a suggestion. What? Yeah, so maybe get nav and main closer together, right? Nav main and then nav main. Maybe that's a good idea. And then containers kind of above them, so I kind of think about my CSS often in terms of like, what's coming first in my page. So maybe like that. What else? What else is crying for? So this right here, you don't put the little sizes on when it's 0. Doesn't matter. So let's get rid of that. The next thing I could do is like, why do I have a div class container when my body is doing the same thing? Sayonara, sucker. It's an unnecessary tag. And now as div class container, I can just now do body. Cool, let's check it. Shift it up a little. Div put in space for whatever reason. But I could fix that with a little bit of margin on the top and bottom. Or better yet, just my whole page. I always say it right that. I don't know why. There we go. So that's looking better. And then we have the nav, ULLI, and then we have main. I like that. So it got cleaned up nicely. Anything else that could be cleaned up here? Position relative. Might be curio, just to say what happens if we take this out. Nothing, because that's pretty much the same top left corner to the HTML. I think. Seems like, no, that's centered, and it's 700. I guess it just goes straight to body, not to HTML. So that doesn't even matter. Static by default, margin, that's the main. I'd probably switch these, because they kind of appear in that order. Oh, actually, nav is before main. Never mind. Cool. All right, I like that. And now let's look at a second iteration. And this one has, instead, before we were looking at the nav has a width of 200, and then main, and this is kind of the magic right here, that and this. How are those connected? How are those working together to create this? Well, this is saying, well, make this guy right here 200 wide, right there, 200 wide. And then this one right here, give it a margin on the left of 200. Like make room for that one over there. That's top, right, bottom, left. And so what happens if I took this down to 0? That doesn't look good. But that's kind of interesting to see that this nav, when we gave it position absolute, it took it out of the document flow. The document flow would just be block, inline, block, inline, block, 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 things stacking up, right? But when we made something position absolute, out of the document flow. That's cool. We take it out of the document flow, but then we got to manually allocate some space. And then this code here, let me just copy that to this one. And this code here, copy it to that one. And then the second one here, I just said, well, let's just do the width 25%, and this one here, 25% on the left, and 2% for top, right, bottom. I don't know, I have something on the bottom. I guess just give it a little padding down here. Oh, that's not the right page. I need to launch this page. So let's see what that looks like. Same deal. So it's just a different way to do it. One was using percent, right, there and there. And one was using pixels. How many people feel like I could just keep going, like, let's just keep going all night? You get that feeling? What kind of homework you guys want? You want me to come up with something? Of course you do. I'll come up with something. So just watch Blackboard, and I'll see you all when. When am I going to see you? Thursday. You guys want to go to the trailers? Before we head home? Let's go to the trailers. I don't go to the movies anymore. Occasionally, I'll go to the trailers. Let's see. How to Be Single, Zoolander, Deadpool, Risen, Hail Caesar, Choice, Race, Witch, The Revenant, Finest Hours. It's got to be about World War II. Massive Spills, 2 trapping more than 30 sailors, and Tinker Stern. All right, we're watching that one.